Well, thank you for having me. I did a presentation on a similar lines back in February, and I don't know, many of you were there for that. I tried to add a little bit more this time. Some of it will repeat, and I hope it's in keeping with the theme that you've set for this Advent series. I missed the first two presentations, and I'm sure Ken did a wonderful job because Ken and Karen are wonderful students, and I always enjoy listening to them present. I have sort of titled this Early Huntington African American because I'm going to cover more 17th, 18th, 19th century history, not get into the 20th century history. And it's a difficult topic in a couple of ways because it's not very well documented. We didn't tend to write about what minorities were doing, and certainly not what enslaved people were doing. People focus on the white settlers and their accomplishments and their doings, but African Americans have been a part of the town of Huntington since the very beginning. Of course, in the beginning, they were enslaved. There was slavery existed in Huntington as early as 1660. Actually, 1660 is the date I get from a court case, which involved two people suing each other, and one of them had gotten the aid of an enslaved person owned by Thomas Matthews. So that's a 1660 reference, but the enslaved person may have come to Huntington as early as 1657, and the town was founded in 1653. So again, as I said, it's from the very beginning of the town. If we fast forward 100 years, in 1755, there was a census of enslaved people throughout New York colony. And we have 84 people in the town of Huntington who were enslaved in 54 households. So that's about 15% of all households at that time held enslaved people. And there were about one or two in most households. A few had more, but that was basically the size. It came out to about 1.5 per household. The largest holder of enslaved people would have been the Lloyd family, who had 8. Technically, they were not part of the town of Huntington at this time. Lloyd Neck did not become part of Huntington until the 1880s. But we like to talk about that because it is now part of the town of Huntington. So we talk about their history as well when we cover this topic. Just for comparison, by 1790, just a couple of decades later, there were more than twice as many enslaved people. So the amount of slavery did increase over those early years. And another interesting fact, I'm not sure what to make of this necessarily, but 15% of all households in the town of Huntington enslaved Africans. If you fast forward to the 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan was active on Long Island, we find that 15% of Long Islanders were members of the Ku Klux Klan. It's an interesting coincidence, I guess, or maybe there's more to it than just coincidence. Now this does not want to advance. So one of the enslaved men in the 1755 census was Dick, and he had been born in 1720, enslaved by John Hewlett of Oyster Bay. And his experience, I think, is probably typical of the lack of agency that people who were enslaved had. And they just were shuffled from place to place, from family to family. So in 1754, he was sold to Benjamin Jarvis of Huntington for 70 pounds. And then 6 years later, sold to Thomas Jarvis. Then a year later to Zophar Platt, and 2 years later to Jonathan Scudder. And 3 years after that to Solomon Ketchum, now for 50 pounds. So you see, over those course of 12 years, he was in 5 different households. And that is something we see again and again in the records, that people are just shuffled around. Oftentimes, enslaved people would be lent out to another household for rent, basically. But they had no agency of their own to determine where they would go. And that'll come in a little later on when we get to manumission. Peter Fleet is another example. He was born in the household of Isaac Skidmore, and when he was 10 years old, he was sold to Gilbert Fleet. And you just go through, he went from Oyster Bay to Brookhaven to Smithtown to North Hempstead, and finally he received his freedom and came back to Huntington married, and had 7 children. So maybe in a way that was a successful story. He did eventually gain his freedom, but during his enslavement, he was really traveled back and forth extensively. Now, many people, of course, didn't take kindly to this, the enslaved, and they ran away. We now sometimes call that self-emancipation. It was quite common, and it indicates the difficult conditions that they lived in. And you would see in the newspapers these rewards, these runaway slave advertisements. This is from Gilbert Valentine of West Hills section of Huntington. And they usually describe what the person looked like, what clothes they had. There was a real concern that they would get to New York City and get on a boat and then be gone and live a life on the sea and never be returned. Many of the enslaved people were described as having scars from being scalded as children. And you always wonder, was it an accident, or was that a form of punishment when they were younger, that they were scalded intentionally? Excuse me. This is a legal opinion from Silas Wood, who would later become a congressman representing Long Island. In 1817, Benjamin Horton had gotten an enslaved woman from another gentleman for a period of 8 years. And after that period, she was to be given her freedom. But during that 8-year period, she had a baby. And the question became, who owns the baby, if anyone? And Silas Wood did his legal analysis. He was a lawyer. And he said enslaved people are treated as livestock. The same rules that apply to livestock apply to enslaved people. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the baby belongs to the original owner who had him, who had the mother, even though the mother was gaining her freedom. Now, as I mentioned, the Lloyd family had the largest number of slaves in what is now the town of Huntington, up on Lloyd Neck. Lloyd Neck was founded as a provisioning plantation. The real money was in Barbados on the sugar plantations. Many of the people who were enslaved in Huntington came through Barbados, Africa, then Barbados, and then up to Long Island, including Jupiter Hammond's parents and grandparents. The idea was that you would make so much money growing sugar in Barbados that you would not want to spare any land for growing food. So you grow the food on Long Island, ship it down to Barbados to keep people fed, and then maximize your profits down in Barbados. Jupiter Hammond was born in 1711 on Lloyd Neck, which was the same year that Henry Lloyd came down from Boston to take over the neck. His father had purchased the land, purchased part of it and married into the rest of it, and eventually acquired all the land in 1685. And then his son Henry, came down in 1711 to really develop it himself. And Jupiter was born the same year. He ended up being enslaved by 4 generations of the Lloyd family. And in 1760, he published this poem, An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries, which was published on Christmas, 1760. So it's appropriate to this time of year. Mm-hmm. And he thereby became the first published African-American. Phyllis Wheatley published the first book of poetry, but that was a few years later. Jupiter Hammond was the first person who was actually published, and is considered one of the founders of the African-American literary tradition. He went on to publish several more poems, including and essays, including an address to the Negroes of the state of New York, where he talks about how great freedom would be, and comparing it to your final reward in heaven. And he said, as for himself, he was at this point when this was published in his 80s. He did not want to gain freedom here on earth. He was going to look forward to his reward in heaven, where no one can hold being Black against them. This particular edition was published in 1806 after Jupiter Hammond had died. We don't know exactly when he died, but there's a reference to he was already dead by the time of 1806. So it was a republication. And the address and the poem that accompanied it are attributed to some extent to New York State's passage of the Gradual Manumission Act in 1799. As for Jupiter Hammond, he did eventually gain his freedom. Henry Lloyd enslaved him, and then his son, Joseph Lloyd, inherited him, and that's who he was with in 1760. During the American Revolution, they fled to Connecticut because Joseph Lloyd was a patriot, a supporter of the American Revolution. And after one of the battles in 1780, Joseph Lloyd became despondent because the Americans had lost, and he thought the cause of the revolution was lost, and he committed suicide. So Jupiter Hammond was then inherited by his nephew, John Lloyd II. Eventually, after John Lloyd died, it seems that his widow, Amelia Lloyd, manumitted Jupiter, and he was given the income from an orchard on Lloyd Neck to support himself. And he, with his great nephew, Benjamin Hammond, purchased this house, which is on West Shore Road, and lived there for a few years. But after Jupiter died, around 1806, the income from the orchard was no longer available for upkeep of the house, and Benjamin lost the house. Unfortunately, we have these records. We know that this is what happened because Benjamin applied to the overseers of the poor for support later in about 1820, and he set forth his history of having purchased land and then lost the land. Mm-hmm. So the Lloyd family was buried up on Lloyd Neck. They owned the entire neck, and they had a family vault. And on the left is the tablet. It's about 7 feet tall, marble tablet listing the names of everyone who was buried in that family vault. After the last of the Lloyds sold their land about 1910, they decided to reinter the whatever remains they could find in the vault in the Huntington Rural Cemetery. And they moved that marble tablet with them. And there you see it there on the ground at the Huntington Rural Cemetery. No longer stands upright, but it's in the ground and it still exists. And it seems if we look at the place where the vault appears to have been, there are several fieldstone markers surrounding the vault, including these pieces of a quite thick brownstone slab tablet that appears to have been a recycled grave marker. And we believe this is where Jupiter Hammond is buried, up on Lloyd Neck. There's no definitive record of it. But since he died in the early 1800s, the only locations really where he could have been buried are the old burying ground in Huntington Village or up on Lloyd Neck. And it seems likely he was probably buried up on Lloyd Neck, where all the other enslaved people of the Lloyd family had been buried. So the Joseph Lloyd house, where Jupiter Hammond lived, is now owned by Preservation Long Island, which is a island-wide preservation advocacy organization, and they are reinterpreting the house in light of the Jupiter Hammond's contributions. They acquired the house in the 1960s, and it was really interpreted as a colonial mansion, colonial manor house, and that was the emphasis, and the enslaved people were not really talked about too much. Eventually, they started talking about it more, but now they've been on a multi-year project to really reinterpret the house in light of the enslaved people's experience, including Jupiter Hammond. So if you go to the Preservation Long Island website, you can read about what they've done. They've had a series of roundtables with academics and poets to discuss his legacy and the best way forward to present that legacy to the public. And they're still working on it, and it's an ongoing project. And they opened the house a few times this summer with an emphasis on Jupiter Hammond, and I'm sure there's more to come in the future. Just to talk about a few of the other people who were enslaved, I mentioned the Thomas Matthews enslaved a man whose name we don't know, but we know he came in about 1657. He's referenced in the 1660 court case. They eventually moved in 1673 to an area then known as Red Hook, which is really the foot of Main Street in Northport, where it meets 25A and Waterside Drive. So that was called Red Hook, and they lived there. Eventually, that house became owned by the Scudder family, and they had an enslaved man named Sampson, who was born around 1710 and lived to 1760. He had a son, Elijah, who was born in 1750. Elijah eventually made it over to Huntington and was enslaved by the widow Mary Platt. That is not Mary Platt, but that is her house. This is Platt's Tavern, which is where George Washington ate lunch in 1790. It used to sit on Park Avenue right across from the Village Green, so really in the center of the original settlement of town. Elijah became known as a fiddle player, attracted people from all over to hear him play the fiddle, and gained some local notoriety during the American Revolution when Huntington was occupied territory. Hessians were camped out across the street, and they tried to break into Platt's Tavern, probably to get some drinks one night. And Elijah was there to defend the tavern and was shot in the head. But he survived, and he was known as the man with the bulletproof head. And people would come to hear him play the fiddle and see his bulletproof head for the years after the Revolution. I don't think he was still around. Well, actually, he probably was still around when George Washington came, because he died in 1810. So he would have been at Platt's Tavern when George Washington visited in 1790. So this is just to show you the number of enslaved people throughout the years, starting with the federal censuses in 1790. And the only count we have prior to that is the 1755 census I showed you before. So in 1790, we had 213. And then by 10 years later, the numbers started to decrease until we get to zero by 1830. And that is because of the Gradual Manumission Act passed by the state of New York in 1799. And that act basically held that if you were born after July 4th, 1799, you were a free person when you reached the age of majority, which for women was 25 and for men was 28. So you stayed in service to the family that enslaved your mother. Your status came from your mother, and you stayed in service until you reached that age. The law was tweaked over the years until eventually by 1817, it said by 1827, everyone is going to be free. If you were born before 1799, you were going to be free. So if you were born between 1799 and 1827, you really fell into that earlier provision. So you would have been enslaved until you reached the age of 25 or 28. There were provisions for educating. They wanted the enslaved people to be taught to read and write. So if you did not teach them to read and write, they would be freed earlier. So that gives the enslaver an incentive to teach them reading and writing, so they have some means of supporting themselves once they did gain their freedom. And so you can see by 1830, on the census at least, there were no enslaved people in the town of Huntington. And then the free people of color in the town obviously increased in proportion, and increased greatly after 1830, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But just to go into the manumission experience, this is the manumission of Charles, an experience by members of the Conklin family, the siblings in the Conklin family. Their parents had died, and they freed the enslaved people that their parents had owned. Whoops, there we go. And I mentioned before, we had a couple of instances of Dick and Peter Fleet, who were shuffled about from place to place, from household to household. Solomon Ketchum, when he manumitted James in 1799, said he hereby grants him the full power to go where he may see fit. And that's really I guess the essence of the freedom they were granting. You didn't have to be told where to go. You could go wherever you wanted to go, which made a big difference, obviously. So this is a typical application for manumitting someone. The overseers of the poor had to certify that the person was under 50 years of age, because they wanted to make sure they would not become a charge to the town. and they could support themselves. So they had sufficient ability to provide for and maintain themselves. And there, if that was established, then the overseers of the poor would consent to the manumission. Now, there was a provision also in the 1799 law where you had to register any baby born to an enslaved woman with the overseers of the poor. And if you didn't, you had to pay a fine. You had 1 year to register. And at that time, you could also elect to abandon your rights to that baby and therefore not have to take care of them until they reach the age of 25 or 28. You would turn them over to the overseers of the poor when they turned 1 year old. And the overseers of the poor not only took care of formerly enslaved, but anyone who was indigent within the town. And this is basically what the responsibility is. They would rent the people out, I guess, or at least let them out. They would ask people to take in the indigent, and the overseers would pay you for taking care of someone. So if it was someone who was of an age where they could provide some labor that was of benefit to the person taking them in, the overseers would not have to pay as much. But if they were older and could not contribute labor, and they would require more food and upkeep out of the pockets of the person taking them in, then the overseers would have to pay them more. And basically they had to make sure that they had a suitable clothes, etc. And the overseers would pay for the doctoring. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is an affiliation between the overseers of the poor and St. John's Church. The overseers of the poor were elected by the town taxpayers at the annual meeting. And I'm sure many of them probably were members of the church, but it was a governmental function, not a religious function. So there would have been some separation there. It's interesting that after manumission, as I said, the population of free blacks or free people of color in the town of Huntington increased. And there seems to be this interesting Virginia connection, which may be, some of it's just a coincidence, but some of it is attributable to the Crossman brickyards in Lloyd Harbor. Mm-hmm. Was recruiting for labor down in Virginia, not just free blacks, but also white folks from that area. Here, there are three families that we've identified recently, and they're on the banks of the Chesapeake River, Chesapeake Bay, more or less. The Stokely family from Whitham's in Accomack County, Crippen family from Modesttown in Accomack, and the Frazier family from Rappahannock. And I'm sure there's others, but these are a few that we've identified so far. And as I said, they ended up working at the brickyards, which were right up here where West Neck Beach and the Lloyd Harbor Village Park is today, right before you get up to the causeway. And one of those families, as I mentioned, was Stokely. His mother had been manumitted, Abram Stokely, had been manumitted in 1789. By the time he was 26 years old, he had made his way up to Huntington and was working at the Crossman brickyards. He also was joined by a couple of other, two brothers, George and Levin Medad from Accomack County. And he worked closely with George, it seems. They were noted in the papers at one point for husking 100 bushels of corn each in one day from sunrise to sunset. So that's an impressive number of bushels of corn. And it's an impressive number of hours to have done that. He was also one of the incorporators of Bethel AME Church in 1854. The church had actually started in 1843, but they reincorporated in 1854 when they purchased land. So he was involved with that. And we'll see that a lot of these early people of color from Virginia were involved in the founding and running of Bethel AME Church. In the 1850 census, Abram Stokely was living in the Cold Spring Harbor area in a household that contained 23 people. It was split up among three different families. He and his wife and six daughters were one family. His mother-in-law, who we believe to be his mother-in-law, Clarissa Mills, was there with two others. And then there was Julia Jackson and her 11 children, all in one household. So that's 23 people in all. Clarissa Mills is an interesting case. We think she was Abraham Stokely's mother-in-law. She may have also been Peter Crippen's mother-in-law. So it might have been two sisters married these two men. Both came up from Virginia. Clarissa Mills was from Nassau County. By 1860, he was living with three sons and working as a farm laborer in Huntington. Abram died in 1864, and he's buried at Bethel Church. Now, I just want to point out here, where we believe they lived was in Whitehall, which is an area that name has only come up in one place that I've been able to find. And it was in connection with a murder in the 1840s. And Whitehall, because of this murder, we know a little bit about Whitehall. It was a love triangle among three white people. It was a married couple, and then a guy who wanted to run away to Oregon with the wife. And I think the husband ended up shooting this interloper late one night. And they talk about all the people who lived in this area that they called Whitehall. And it was a lot of African-American families. So it was a mixed neighborhood built around one of the mills in Cold Spring Harbor, one of the woolen mills. There were several mills in Cold Spring Harbor. One of them there is on the second lake on Route 108, Harbor Road. And that is interesting. That's the only reference to Whitehall anywhere, is because of this murder case. And that's how we know about this mixed neighborhood. A lot of the people from that neighborhood and other places in Cold Spring Harbor are probably buried in the Harbor Road burying ground, which is near Lawrence Hill Road on Harbor Road. I'll get into that a little bit later on, but I also wanted to point out the Fraser House up on Goose Hill Road, which is across from the synagogue, an old converted house. It was the Hewlett House converted to a synagogue. And this is the Fraser House. This was a tenant house for William Hewlett's farm workers. And Aaron Fraser's parents had come from Rappahannock, Virginia. They arrived in Huntington around 1830, again, as many of the others did. The family seemed to have lived down in Whitehall. And then Aaron, who was born in 1808, found work with William Hewlett and lived in this tenant house, which was built in 1849. It has been preserved, fortunately. A lot of these smaller, more marginal houses are not preserved. The land was subdivided in the 1990s. And at that point, all of Goose Hill Road was in a historic district, so the house had to be saved. It is now in the backyard of a new modern house that's about 25 years old. And I think it's just used for storage, but at least it still stands. And it's in fairly good condition, except for the branch that's going through the little porch roof. So a lot of these people that lived in Cold Spring Harbor are probably buried in the Harbor Road burying ground. This is something that used to be called the Jones Cemetery. This is a picture of it a few years ago. You can see it became a bit of a dump. People were dumping all sorts of things there. Landscapers were dumping piles of leaves. There was a lot of litter, including an abandoned jet ski. But working with St. John's Church, Cold Spring Harbor, we have cleaned it up, and now it's in much better shape. Most of the grave markers here are just simple boulders like this. This one has initials on it, and it looks like maybe a date in the bottom. It's hard to make out. There are about 3 dozen of these markers, but there's room for many more burials than that. So there may be 100, 200 or more people buried here. Unfortunately, we don't know who they are because there's these fieldstone markers. The only 2 markers that have names, the traditional marble headstones, are Alfred Thorne and his mother, Patience. Alfred Thorne died in 1900. The cemetery was identified on early maps and early documents as a cemetery for Jones family retainers, or African-American retainer. They wouldn't have said African-American. Negro, I think they said Negro retainers. These are old documents. So for many years, it was called the Jones Cemetery. And we kind of decided, well, why should the Jones get any notoriety? They're not buried here. It's other people are buried here. So we changed the name to the Harbor Road Burying Ground. And it still seems that St. John's Church in Cold Spring Harbor retains ownership, and they have been keeping up with it with at least annual cleanups and making sure it's preserved in some extent. We've tried to identify people who are buried there by looking at the death records from the town of Huntington. which unfortunately the state did not require death records to be kept until 1881. Prior to that, there's absolutely no records because the town was not required to keep them. But starting in 1881, we've identified 18 people buried there. One more person we've identified because for a brief period in the 1840s, the state did require those records just for a couple of years, and then that law was repealed. So we have 19 names. One more has been identified by a newspaper article. So we know of 20 people plus Patience and Alfred. And a lot of them probably lived in Oyster Bay because they did have an association with the Jones family. Alfred Thorne, for instance, was a coachman for Dr. Oliver Jones. So their death records would be in the town of Oyster Bay, and we haven't had a chance to check those yet. But once we do, I'm sure we'll find many more names. Now, that was sort of Cold Spring Harbor area of settlement for a lot of these settlers. There was also a great deal of African-American settlement in the Huntington Harbor area. So this is Route 110, New York Avenue, and here's the harbor up here in Milldam Park. And this is the Jupiter Hammond house I pointed out before on West Shore Road, where Jupiter Hammond lived. The Amelia Lloyd house, which is the townhouse that John Lloyd Jr. moved to after her husband died when she was a widow. So she had a house in town instead of being up on the neck. This is where Bethel AME Church, which was founded in 1843, they actually purchased the old seminary building of the Huntington Methodist Episcopal Church and used that for many years until they built a new building in 1924. And up here next to the sewage treatment plant is the Peter Crippen house. I want to talk a little bit about Peter Crippen. Again, he's somebody who came up from Virginia in the 1830s. We believe, and this is the house he would have bought in 1864. This is an artist rendering of what it would have looked like. Peter Crippen was born in around 1809. His father had been manumitted 10 years previously by William, I think it was William Crippen was the name of the master, the enslaver. And then he was manumitted again by Sarah Crippen, the original enslaver's daughter, along with his son, Peter Crippen. So it's a little unclear if Peter Crippen was ever enslaved or was born free, because as I said before, the status of someone born was dependent on their mother's status. And we don't know who Peter Crippen's mother was and whether she was manumitted along with his father in that earlier manumission. But in any event, the family believes he was never enslaved. He did come up and work in the brickyards along with Abram Stokely and the Madads and several other people coming from Virginia for many years. He eventually, and we know he was in the brickyards. This is what the house looks like now. That house I showed you before. This is the artist rendering, and this is what it looks like today. This is the Crossman account books from the brickyard from 1836, 1838. You can see here's Peter Crippen's page, and they talk about all the cash he was paid, the cash he paid back to the company store. It was a company town, and you lived in company housing and went to the company store, and you would load 16 tons and another day older and deeper in debt, it seemed. But he did manage to save some money. He eventually left the brickyards, worked in West Hills for a few years, and then by 1860 he was in Huntington and purchased that house in 1864. His neighbor was a gentleman named Nelson Smith, who had purchased a house right next door in 1854. This is a sketch of Nelson done in 1883 for Harper's Weekly by an artist named Frost, who had spent a few years in Huntington and made this sketch. And we know it's Nelson Smith, or we're pretty sure it's Nelson Smith, because the Long Islander reported on this illustration being published in Harper's Weekly. And they said anyone who knows Nelson Smith knows that this is him. How good a likeness it is, or whether it's a bit of a caricature, is a little unclear. But it's again another Christmas morning theme. So we have the an evening prayer, which was published on Christmas Day in 1760, and now this Christmas morning 1883 illustration. And Nelson Smith was one of the founders, along with Stokely and Peter Crippen of the Bethel AME Church. This is a illustration, a somewhat fuzzy illustration from a newspaper in the 1890s showing the original church building that would have been the old seminary for the Methodist Episcopal Church. And as I said, in 1824, it was replaced by the current building, which stands on Park Avenue across from Huntington Hospital. Now, getting back to Peter Crippen's house, this is what it looked like back around 1960. I see the house is in fairly good shape, but it's right up against the sewage treatment plant. And when the sewage treatment plant was being proposed in 1917, there were complaints from many local people, including Peter Crippen's son, William Crippen, who didn't want it built right next to his house. But as the way these things go, they did go ahead and build it there. There was another African-American settlement on Oakwood Road known as Cottage Hill, just south of the Huntington Rural Cemetery. And there are still a few houses there up on Boxer Court and Oakwood Road. And again, you see an African-American settlement, and what does the town put there but the town dump at the top of that hill, right next to the houses. So it's a recurring theme. This is a larger picture showing the house and the sewage treatment plant zoomed out. So this is a current picture, and you may have read about the Crippen house and efforts to save it and do something with it to restore it and make it worthwhile. It is believed that in addition to being an early African-American dwelling, the building itself was the first mill in the town of Huntington from the 1650s. And it would have been located down here by this blue arrow on Mill Lane between New York Avenue and Wall Street. The mill was abandoned in 1672 and a new mill was built in Centerport. The building was then moved up to this location on Creek Road and converted into a dwelling. And it was lived in for 200 years until Peter Crippen purchased it. This is a little close up. You see the sewage treatment plant really surrounds it on two sides. And here's the house here. The sewage treatment plant has now purchased the property, and they want to put a parking lot there and expand their facility. And the house is in the way, but we do want to do something to save it. So we have a proposal to move it. This is just what it looked like in 2006. So you can see it was still in fairly good shape. Today, these windowsills are in the mud. It's slowly sinking into the mud. We did an archaeological study last year, and these are a few of the artifacts they found. They found 513 artifacts, and under archaeological standards, that calls for a phase 2 study, which we hope to do early next year and discover more about the property and the people who live there. Here are a few more. This is a little children's tea set and spoon. And this is quartz biface. So it's something that was worked by the indigenous people, thousands of years ago, and it survives on the site. So our hope is to move the house up to where the star is in this empty field next to the northern roundabout, right behind the Nathan Hale Rock. The town board has allocated funding to deconstruct the house. We considered trying to move it in one piece, and that seems to be impractical from the standpoint of having to eventually repair a lot of the timbers. It is a timber frame building, which means you can take it apart. They're pegged together. You can take the beams apart like an erector set, store them, and then eventually re-erect them on a new site. We're hoping to do that soon, early part of next year, to have it deconstructed. And then we need a commitment from the town board on the location to reconstruct. This is what we've suggested, and it seems to be met with some favor, but there's no commitment yet. So we have to wait for that commitment before we can move forward with the reconstruction. But at least we'll deconstruct it and get it out of harm's way, get it out of the weather, and put it inside somewhere where the timbers will be protected for the future. This is a conceptual site plan prepared by the Laurel Group, which is very involved in local activities, certainly with parks. And it shows what that site could look like. parking lot here. Here's the reconstructed house. This is a larger part of the house, which was built after Peter Crippen died in the 1880s, which is in horrible, horrible shape and would not be moved. This is the old part from the 17th century that has been determined to be eligible for listing on the National Register. That's what we would move. And then there's room here for a African-American history museum. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the town board has renamed Creek Road an honorary name, Peter Crippen Way, and there's a historic marker marking the site so that people won't forget where it was. And an interesting thing, that the house remained in the Crippen family until 2019. Raymond Carman, who I think the great grandson of Peter Crippen, lived there until he died in 2001. And his son, Kit, who's actually also named Raymond, was a musician and traveled all across the country in the 70s and 80s. And this is from a CD that he did from a 1974 show in somewhere in the Midwest. So I thought it was interesting that he continues. He's very involved with the project, up to date, and very excited that something will be done to save his house. He used to play locally in Heckscher Park, what they would call a hootenanny. I don't know if anyone knows what a hootenanny is, but I can explain it. So one other gentleman that I wanted to talk about, who also came from Virginia, but not from Accomack County, he was from Westmoreland, Virginia, is Samuel Bolton. He came up a little bit later. He was younger than Peter Crippen and the others that we've talked about. This is his picture. He actually escaped from slavery 3 times. He was a young man at the outbreak of the Civil War. He had recently gotten married to Rebecca, and he was sent to work on the railroads to keep the railroad tracks in good repair during the war, because they were constantly being bombed and they had to be rebuilt. So during Pentecost, in the early years of the Civil War, I think it was 61 or 62, he and a bunch of other workers escaped because it was a 3-day holiday and no work was going on. Then he ran into one of the overseers, and they just kind of pretended they were on a little sojourn, not that they were running away, and they got away with it. He went back to the plantation to get his wife, but determined it wasn't safe. He went up to the northern lines, came back again, and again thought it wasn't safe to take Rebecca away, and went back a 3rd time. And that time he took Rebecca, who was pregnant, and her mother, and escaped. They walked about 50 miles to freedom in 14 hours overnight, which is pretty remarkable to have been able to do that. And then he joined Wisconsin Regiment and Massachusetts Regiment and continued to serve in the war. He was a cook, which is what often a lot of the African Americans were in the white units. This is his wife, Rebecca, obviously in later years when they moved up to Greenlawn. He arrived in Greenlawn about 1873. Here he is in one of the Memorial Day parades in Northport. He's standing back here. He always participated in the parades. This is the Greenlawn that he came to in 1873. And as he described it, it had one little grocery store, one little butcher shop, and one little hotel. He was a tenant farmer, some might say a sharecropper, for the Gardner family, leased out land, grew crops, especially pickles, and he became well known as a prolific pickle grower. He didn't introduce the idea of growing cucumbers for pickling. That was Alexander Gardner, but he grew 1.5 million pickles in 1 year, and therefore became known as the Pickle King. And there was an article about the bumper pickle crop that year, and Samuel Bolton was the only one named in the article. None of the other farmers in town were named. He was so successful with the farming that he started to acquire land, actually in Rebecca's name, and to develop it, subdivide it, and build houses. So this is land he bought with his son-in-law, James Jackson. This is Broadway and the railroad down here. So if you're familiar with the old fields in Greenlawn, that's where the Hudson Hotel was. That's now Oldfields. The post office is up around here. So he put in Smith Street and Grange Avenue, which are the names of the families he acquired the land from, and started to build houses. And 3 of his houses in this area still survive. Years later, he purchased land to the east at the other end of Boulevard, sometimes known as Boulevard Extension, because the thought was that the railroad was going to relocate the station house from Broadway over to Taylor Avenue. So he wanted to be in the middle of town. Again, built this building as a store and fitted it out, but then they built the railroad just across Broadway, still in that area where it is today. So his granddaughter, Bernice Easton, lived in this house until she died in the early 2000s. Across the street, he built 2 houses that are kind of twins. This is one of them. This is where he and Rebecca celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1901. Peter Crippen died in 1917 and is buried at the Huntington Rural Cemetery. And this is the green lawn that's a little more developed than when he came in 1873. So this is 1909. There's a lot more settlement here in the area. Now, I just want to touch on education in the 19th century. And we are all familiar with desegregation, Brown versus the Board of Education. But when free schooling was introduced in New York in the 1840s, 1850s, it was open to everyone. And we have an excerpt from a diary written by a girl in Cold Spring Harbor, Ellen Rogers. And she describes in January 1850, when the new free school opened in Cold Spring Harbor, there were 3 Negro girls and 4 Negro boys who had been sent by the farmers, to which they were bound for the purpose of getting some learning, for which said farmers were taxed. But as the fairer portion, which means the white students, seemed to despise them amazingly, they were formed in a separate division, and in the absence of a sufficient number of benches, seated themselves on the floor. And they complained about people stepping over them and not treating them very well. And it says bound out. They were not enslaved at this point. They were indentured servants. And if you look at the census records from that period, many of the families in Cold Spring Harbor had a young African-American boy or girl living with the family, probably to do household chores. And since the farmers were paying taxes, they decided to have them get some education as well. In Huntington, similarly, in the 1850s, starting in 1853, there was a provision in state law to create union-free school districts. And that has nothing to do with labor unions. It's a union of 2 or more common school districts, which are districts that run from 1st grade to 8th grade. And a union-free district, the free referred to there would be free of tuition. A union-free school district could also have a high school. And Huntington formed its union-free school district in 1858, and they built the Union School, which is this building, which stood on the site where the town hall is today. And there was a question, what do we do with the Black children in town? And they decided, well, we're going to set up a separate division. They called it the colored division. And they set aside a room in the basement, 12 feet by 15 feet, which is not very big. And there were 25 to 30 students educated in that small room with 2 windows. There was, some concern that it was not sufficient. The teachers didn't think there was sufficient ventilation, and a lot of the teachers quit. They couldn't keep teachers for the African-American children. At one point, they advertised in the New York City schools for a janitor, an intelligent African-American, they would have said Black man, to be the janitor and also to teach the children of color. People thought that was kind of ridiculous. Why are you looking for a janitor who's also a teacher? You're not going to find anybody. And indeed, they didn't. Eventually, they did find a teacher who didn't have to do the janitorial duties. And then in 1865, there was a question of, should we expand that room for the African-American children, or should we build a separate building on the property? And the taxpayers voted no repeatedly. They didn't want to spend more money and kept the children there. By 1870, they did build an addition onto this building and provided more room. And they reported on the colored division, and it had 25 to 30 students continually. mostly in the younger grades. As they got older, as with the white students as well, they didn't continue their education. But by 1893, Huntington decided to do away with this separate but supposedly equal education. I don't think it was ever really very equal. And it was not for any altruistic or racial justice reasons. It was to save money. It was costing twice as much per student to educate the students in the students of color than the white students. So they decided to just do away with it and integrate the school completely. And 7 years later, in 1900, New York State passed a law saying you could no longer have separate Black schools. So Huntington was a little ahead of its time, but not for a necessarily good reason. It was only to save money. Now, I should point out that I've done a lot of this research myself, and obviously I'm not African American. There is a sign that I saw in Zurich. This is an exhibit about the Roma, and it says nothing about us without us. And it really should be something that we shouldn't be necessarily discussing any group's history or culture without their involvement. And I do work with members of the Huntington African American Historic Designation Council, and they have published several booklets, and this is a compendium of all their booklets published in one volume. You can find this on the town's website. If you go to huntingtonny.gov and just do a search for AAHDC, African American Historic Designation Council, it will pop up and you'll see each of the individual booklets. And this February 2019 is a compendium of all of them. And it has some wonderful stories, mostly about families and people who were active in the 20th century. And not necessarily so much of the earlier history. There's a discussion of Booker T. Washington and John Coltrane, as well as Samuel Bolton. Elijah is mentioned. Richie Robson, who was the first African-American policeman in the town of Huntington. Richard Alexander, and several others. Or Alexander Richardson, I'm sorry, and several others. And an outgrowth of the Historic Designation Council was the creation of the Huntington African American Museum. This is an earlier logo for the museum. They're still trying to come up with a new logo, but that is a new not-for-profit that just received its charter from the State Board of Regents in the fall, and they have set up their bylaws. They have appointed a board of directors, and they're doing a lot of their housekeeping, and they're spearheading the effort to save the Peter Crippen House and make it a cornerstone of a new Huntington African American Museum, which, as I said before, they hope to build on the site next to the Nathan Hale Rock. And that is all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. We're trying to look up early members of our parish and then look at a directory for who owned slaves. So what we're trying to do, we have lists of names of people who owned slaves, but we're trying to find out if they were members of our parish. One of the ways we have looked at this is through our cemetery and the cemetery list that we have, but we're looking for other ideas, and we've got a committee who's going to be doing some research on that so that we can look at the specifics of who actually belonged to St. John's back in our early years. Do you have any suggestions on how to find out that information?
So you don't have a comprehensive list of who was a member back then?
No, we don't.
No, we had a fire and we lost some of our early materials.
Yeah, that's going to be very difficult. I don't think there would be anything on the town level that would tell us who was a member of the church. It would have to be a church record, whether you have it or the diocese. I don't know what kind of things they would have. There were no newspapers back at that period in Huntington locally, so we couldn't see a notice of the Sunday picnic is coming up and these are the people organizing it, these are the people going. That's not going to come till later on. So I think that's a good idea. I think we should do the diocesan library. I don't think we've had anybody look up that and see what they have.
Keep in mind, we predated the Diocese of Long Island.
When did they start?
I don't recall. but we're first
They-
in the Diocese of New York. So
But they
maybe
could have collected things from before when they
Okay.
started.
possibly, okay. But probably we should look at both, inquire both. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a good idea. I'll check at our library. They might have some materials.
Now, this is also interesting, Robert. I know, I believe it was in February, you had mentioned that some of the town's records were lost, or perhaps somewhere, they were sent somewhere. Perhaps it was the time of the of the invasion, if you will, of the area during the colonial wars, but they were sent to Connecticut. Do I recall that you were saying something of that, and you weren't really sure where or how to get them back or anything like that? Is that
I
something?
don't think I said that.
Right.
I don't remember saying that.
Okay,
No, we still have a lot of the records. They're preserved in the town clerk's archives in town hall, the basement of town hall, and a lot of the early records were published in the 80s. Charles R. Street, who was a local lawyer who later became town supervisor, transcribed the records with the help of his daughter, and then he annotated them, with a lot of footnotes to explain some of the things that were in them. Now, I noticed that if you look at the manumission papers, there were about 160 people we know were enslaved based on the census records, but we only have papers for about 97 people. So there are a lot that were missing. I don't know if they were shipped anywhere. They've just not been kept, and they've just been lost over the years. So we don't have a full and complete record, but we have quite a bit.
Okay.
It is tough when you're trying to recreate, the history. And if you don't have the documents and you don't necessarily have the oral histories, you have very little to work with.
I have a
Well,
question.
there
How much
requirement-
was Huntington and Oyster Bay, Cold Spring Harbor used in the harbors? And when ships came into this area, were there slaves on those ships?
There probably were. It's hard to know. I mean, we obviously had a lot of enslaved people living in the area, and did they work in the mills? Did they only work on the farms? I don't think there's any way to that sure, but there was a significant population in Cold Spring Harbor, even after manumission. Must have been working in the mills and the shipyards. There was a lot more industry back then than there is now. And they needed manual labor to do, all sorts of things. The brickyards, as I mentioned.
Was there a lot of shipping business at that time in the harbors?
Yeah, there was a lot of shipping from Long Island to the West Indies, especially, and up along the coast into New York City and up to Boston. There was constant shipping back and forth. That's how people would get their farm goods out to market. One of the big exports was not necessarily crops, but cordwood. They need wood in the city to keep the houses warm. And we had a lot of trees out here, so we would chop the wood and send it out. And that's in Northport, sort of how Northport got its start, was as a shipping point for cordwood. Built the first dock in 1810 at Bryant's Landing to ship out cordwood, and then eventually they expanded into shipbuilding. So shipbuilding yards, mostly in Northport, but also Huntington, Cold Spring Harbor. And Cold Spring Harbor also had the whaling, and there were a lot of people of color on the whale voyages as well.
Robert, going into the 18th century, was there a requirement for a marriage license from the town, even though someone would be getting married in a church?
No, I don't think a license was required probably to the 1880s when they started keeping those kinds of records. The best source of that is church records, and we do have some. Reverend Pry at Old First Church kept records, and they've been published, and that's in the 18th century, of baptisms and marriages. And I'm sure St. John's. I've seen some of the records. Fire damage though they are, that's a really tremendous resource that needs to be transcribed, and that's a difficult job because they're hard to make out sometimes. And the paper is very fragile, but I think that would be a tremendous resource for town history as well as church history.
What year was the fire at St. John's in Huntington?
I'm not remembering.
I'm not sure I know.
Yeah, and I'm not remembering either.
Yeah.
20th century, relatively recent, I think. That could it be the 1970s?
No.
Okay, gotcha.
I'm not sure. I bet.
It was sooner than that.
Much earlier than that, yeah.
Okay.
It was when
Allison-
we moved, it was when we moved to a newer location. The workers
it's
were working
that
on it,
fire.
and that's when the fire was caused. Somebody left
The
a
church.
torch, on the roof, and that's what caused the fire, one of the workmen. So they were working on the new church, our current church building, and that's when it happened.
So when about was that, Heather?
Yeah. You know what?
1906.
Let me look back at our history and I'll get an answer for that, because we do have something published. If-
Sounds like
Where's
somebody
Ken
said
Quinn when you need him. Ken would have
Somebody
an answer at the top, off the top of his head here.
it did sound like somebody had an answer.
Yeah, Ken Quinn, who's a church historian.
No, I mean somebody here was trying to say it.
Oh, I'm sorry,
The
That-
current church was built in 1906.
1806.
If it was during construction of this church, that would be 1906.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know that, I mean, we had,
The previous church on Park Avenue had burnt down just before that. And I don't know if that was the fire, but
yes.
Heather seems to think it was in the new church.
That's-
You might be right. It might have been the prior church. The 1906, I believe, is just our extension here in Huntington. Here in, I know where we are currently located. That newer part of the church that was built, that was 1906, wasn't it? Anybody?
That's when the church was built, all of it.
That's what the
Um,
cornerstone says.
Yeah.
We had a great time looking at our church marriage records, and a lot of them that were relevant were actually later than you would have expected, because the names of the people, I mean, many of the families that Robert named, we have a lot of Frasers and things like that. And it was really interesting to see that they showed up in our parish records as well. And one sort of interesting trend was that they were represented pretty significantly, especially in the marriage records, sometimes in the baptism records. And it was really interesting because the wealthy members of our church almost never got married at the church. And the narrative that we were sort of telling ourselves was that that they were being married in the city, that this was their kind of summer parish, and that, when they were also active in a parish in Manhattan, that the weddings were happening there of the wealthy sort of founding members of the church, which was sort of interesting trend. So even though you had the fire, you might find even in the records that you have that are since the fire, that there may be names of some of these families represented.
Right.
And it's quite interesting as well too, because I don't know if your community has this same sort of memory, but especially the folks living in Lloyd Harbor and Lloyd Neck, like they know who lived in what house when, like back to like wherever. And so like the house that Robert put up that was made of the historic designation on Goose Hill Road, that was an ancillary building to another house that was across the street that that one of our current parishioners grew up in, and so like we can be like, that's George Lindsay's house. And so there's just really it's once you start kind of poking around on these things, it's really amazing to see the specificity of the connections too.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of
That sounds like
information
some
out
of the
there
fun we're gonna have.
Yeah.
gathering it.
Well, we need to have people like Ford Spilsbury with us, because I know his mother was very knowledgeable of those kinds of connections. And she sadly is no longer with us, but Ford may have some sort of institutional memory there.
And is he down south now?
The Spilsburys, they were over in
Ford.
Huntington,
It did
Harbor?
Ford in Huntington Bay,
Huntington Bay,
yeah.
right, Huntington Bay, right.
Baycrest, but I thought Ford moved out of town.
Yeah,
He's
right.
in the city now.
He is, but he's still worshiping with us. So we do see
Oh,
him
good.
quite a bit, right? Yeah,
He'll be in Saturday night. He was in last weekend. He comes out a lot.
yeah.
No, good. Tell him I said hi.
Okay,
All right, we shall. Well, thank you so much. Really interesting
welcome.
stuff and will really help us. We recorded this, if you don't mind, because we want to go
That's
back
fine.
and look at some of the things when we go to some of the names. When we find the names, we can go back and look at some of this information. So we greatly appreciate it. I want to wish you a happy holiday and thank you so much for being here.
yes,
All right, you're welcome. Merry Christmas.
the same to you. And we will be in touch as we continue the project, okay? Right.
Oh, great,
We'll have some
great.
questions.
That sounds wonderful.
Thank you.
All right.